The fluorescent lights hummed their usual midnight symphony as Anthony Rodriguez pushed his cleaning cart down the empty corridors of Meridian Financial Tower. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 34, he had perfected the art of becoming invisible during his night shifts, moving through the gleaming corporate world like a shadow among shadows. The building's 42 floors housed some of the most powerful executives in the city. But by the time Anthony arrived at 10 p.m., their corner offices stood empty, leaving only the scent of expensive coffee and ambition lingering in the air. Tonight felt different, though Anthony couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the storm brewing outside, sending sheets of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Or maybe it was the nagging worry about his 8-year-old son Marcus, who had been asking increasingly difficult questions about why Daddy worked when other parents were home. Anthony had learned to compartmentalize these thoughts during his shifts, focusing instead on the rhythmic motions of mopping, dusting, and emptying trash bins that kept food on their table and paid for Marcus's asthma medications. The 37th floor was always his favorite, not because the work was easier, but because the executive suites had the best views of the city's skyline, and sometimes, in those quiet moments between cleaning tasks, Anthony would allow himself to imagine what it might feel like to sit behind one of those massive mahogany desks, making decisions that affected thousands of lives instead of just cleaning up after the people who did. As he approached the supply closet near the corner office, Anthony heard something that made him pause. It was barely audible over the storm outside, but unmistakably human. A soft whimpering sound, like someone trying very hard not to cry. He stood frozen for a moment, his hand on the closet door handle, wondering if he should investigate or simply pretend he hadn't heard anything. In his 5 years working at Meridian Financial, Anthony had learned that the less he saw and heard, the safer his job remained. But the sound came again, more desperate this time, and Anthony's instincts as a father overrode his caution. He knocked gently on the closet door. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by the kind of silence that comes from holding your breath and hoping the world will forget you exist. "Hello?" Anthony called softly. "Are you okay in there?" The closet door opened slowly, revealing a woman who looked nothing like Anthony expected to find hiding among the cleaning supplies and printer paper. She was probably in her early 30s, wearing what had clearly been an expensive business suit before it became wrinkled from hours of sitting on the floor. Her dark hair had escaped from what must have been a perfect updo earlier in the day, and her makeup was smudged from tears she was trying desperately to hide. But it was her eyes that caught Anthony off guard. They held the same exhausted desperation he recognized in his own mirror each morning. The look of someone who was barely holding everything together, and terrified that one more small thing might cause it all to collapse. "I'm sorry," she whispered, scrambling to stand up and smooth down her skirt. "I didn't think anyone would be up here this late. I'll go." Anthony found himself stepping back to give her space, but something in her voice made him stay. "You don't have to go anywhere," he said quietly. "This is a big building. There's room for both of us." She looked at him then, really looked at him, taking in his uniform and cleaning cart with what Anthony expected to be the usual mixture of pity and dismissal he received from the building's executives. Instead, her expression was almost grateful, as if his presence was exactly what she needed but had been too afraid to ask for. "I'm Victoria," she said, extending a hand that trembled slightly. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now, back to the story. Victoria Chen. Anthony knew that name. Everyone who worked in the building knew that name. Victoria Chen was the youngest CEO in Meridian Financial's history, the woman who had taken over the company after her father's sudden death 2 years ago, and turned it into one of the most successful firms on the West Coast. She was featured on magazine covers and business journals, always photographed with the kind of confident smile that suggested she had never encountered a problem she couldn't solve. The woman standing in front of him looked nothing like those magazine photos. "Anthony Rodriguez," he replied, shaking her hand. "And you look like you could use a friend right now." What Victoria whispered next would change everything Anthony thought he knew about success, about worth, and about the invisible walls that separate one world from another. But that moment was still coming, and Anthony had no idea that this chance encounter in a supply closet would transform not just his own life, but the lives of everyone around him in ways he never could have imagined. Victoria Chen stared at Anthony for what felt like an eternity, her carefully constructed composure cracking like ice under pressure. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the exhaustion that no amount of expensive concealer could hide. She had been sitting in that supply closet for 3 hours, hoping the solitude would help her figure out how to tell her entire company that everything they had worked for was about to disappear. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm outside. "I'm supposed to have all the answers. People depend on me. Thousands of employees, their families, investors who trusted me with their life savings. And I've failed them all." Anthony leaned against his cleaning cart, something about her vulnerability making him forget the vast difference in their social standing. In that moment, she wasn't the powerful CEO whose photograph hung in the lobby downstairs. She was just another person drowning in circumstances beyond her control, and Anthony knew that feeling intimately. "When my wife died 4 years ago," Anthony said quietly, "I thought I had failed at everything that mattered. I couldn't save her, couldn't provide the life I'd promised her, couldn't even figure out how to make breakfast for Marcus without burning it. Some mornings I'd sit in my car in the hospital parking lot, wondering how I was supposed to take care of a 4-year-old when I couldn't even take care of myself." Victoria looked up at him with surprise. In her world of board meetings and strategic planning sessions, personal revelations were rare and carefully calculated. But there was something in Anthony's tone that suggested he wasn't trying to impress her or gain anything from sharing his pain. He was simply offering the only comfort he knew how to give. "What did you do?" she asked. "I learned that sometimes failing at one thing doesn't mean you're a failure at everything," Anthony replied. "And I discovered that asking for help isn't the same as giving up." Victoria let out a bitter laugh. Easy to say when you're not responsible for 7,000 jobs and a company that's about to lose its biggest client. "My board called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're going to demand my resignation. And honestly, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not cut out for this." Anthony studied her face, recognizing something in her expression that reminded him of Marcus when he was struggling with a particularly difficult math problem. It wasn't incompetence he saw, but the kind of overwhelming pressure that makes even capable people doubt their abilities. "What happened with the client?" he asked, settling down on an overturned bucket beside her. Victoria hesitated for a moment, as if sharing business information with a janitor violated some unspoken rule of corporate hierarchy. But the isolation of the past few weeks had left her desperate for someone, anyone, who might listen without judgment. "Global Tech Industries," she said finally. "They've been our anchor client for 15 years, representing about 40% of our revenue. Last week, their new CEO decided to terminate our contract and move their business to Henderson and Associates. They said our vision no longer aligns with their strategic direction, which is corporate speak for, we found someone cheaper." Anthony nodded thoughtfully. During his night shifts, he had overheard countless phone conversations and boardroom discussions. He might not have an MBA, but he understood the language of business survival better than most people realized. "Why Henderson and Associates?" he asked. "They promised Global Tech a 20% reduction in fees and a faster turnaround on their quarterly reports." Victoria explained. "It's a good deal for Global Tech, but Henderson can only offer those prices because they're willing to cut corners. They use automated systems for most of their analysis, employ fewer experienced analysts, and they have a track record of missing critical market indicators. But their presentation was flashy, and their numbers looked impressive in a spreadsheet. So they're choosing quick and cheap over thorough and reliable," Anthony observed. "Exactly. And now I have to figure out how to keep this company afloat without our biggest revenue source. We've got 3 months of operating expenses in reserve, maybe 4 if we make some serious cuts, but layoffs would devastate morale, and reducing our service quality would just drive away more clients." Anthony was quiet for several minutes, his mind working through the problem from angles that Victoria might not have considered. His years of working multiple jobs to support Marcus had taught him creative solutions to seemingly impossible financial situations. "Have you considered that losing global tech might actually be an opportunity?" he said finally. Victoria looked at him as if he had suggested that bankruptcy might be fun. "How could losing 40% of our revenue possibly be an opportunity?" "Because now you don't have to structure your entire business around one client's demands," Anthony explained. "When Marcus was little, I worked 3 part-time jobs instead of looking for one full-time position. I thought having 3 sources of income was riskier than having one steady paycheck. But when I finally got laid off from my full-time job at the warehouse, I realized that depending too heavily on one source of anything makes you vulnerable." He gestured toward the window, where rain continued to pound against the glass. "Your company has been so focused on keeping global tech happy that you've probably turned down other opportunities that might have been more profitable in the long run." Victoria considered this, remembering several potential clients they had declined because their requirements would have conflicted with global tech's preferences. "We have turned down some interesting projects," she admitted. "There's a consortium of environmental startups that wanted us to develop a new kind of sustainability analysis. The work would have been challenging, but Global Tech's CEO thought environmental concerns were a passing fad that would hurt their stock price." "What did you think about the environmental project?" Anthony asked. "Honestly, I thought it was fascinating. The potential for growth in that sector is enormous, and the kind of analysis they wanted would have positioned us as leaders in a completely new market. But keeping global tech happy seemed more important than taking risks on unproven opportunities." Anthony smiled, the first genuine expression of optimism Victoria had seen from anyone in weeks. "So maybe global tech did you a favor by leaving. Now you can pursue the projects that actually excite you instead of just the ones that pay the bills." "It's not that simple," Victoria protested. "Those environmental startups couldn't afford to pay us what global tech was paying. We'd need to find a way to make smaller projects profitable, and that would require completely restructuring our business model." "Or finding a lot more smaller clients," Anthony suggested. "Instead of depending on one giant client, you could build relationships with dozens of smaller companies. It would take more work initially, but it would also make your business much more stable long-term." Victoria stared at him, her mind beginning to race with possibilities she hadn't considered. "You're talking about completely changing how we operate. Moving from a few large-scale projects to many smaller ones. Developing expertise in emerging markets instead of just following established trends. I'm talking about building something that reflects your actual interests and strengths instead of just trying to please someone else," Anthony said. "When I stopped trying to be the perfect employee for other people and started focusing on being the best father I could be for Marcus, everything else started falling into place." For the first time in weeks, Victoria felt a spark of excitement about her company's future instead of just dread about its survival. The man sitting beside her in work clothes and rubber gloves had helped her see possibilities that her expensive consultants and board members had missed entirely. "How did you get so wise about business strategy while working as a janitor?" she asked. Anthony's expression grew thoughtful. "I used to be an accountant," he said quietly. "Before Marcus was born, I worked for a mid-size firm downtown. I was good at it, but the hours were killing me. I was working 60-hour weeks, missing everything important in my wife's pregnancy, and convincing myself that success meant sacrificing everything else for career advancement." "What changed?" "Elena, my wife, had complications during delivery. I was in a client meeting when she went into labor, and I almost missed Marcus's birth because I thought a contract negotiation was more important than being there for my family." Elena never said anything, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. That's when I realized I had my priorities completely backwards. Victoria felt a chill of recognition. How many important moments had she missed while chasing the next client or preparing for the next board meeting? How many relationships had she neglected in favor of building her professional reputation? After Elena died, Anthony continued, "I tried to go back to accounting, but I couldn't focus. The work that used to challenge me felt meaningless compared to taking care of Marcus. So I found jobs that let me be present for him, even if they paid less and didn't come with prestigious titles." "Don't you miss it?" Victoria asked. "The intellectual challenges." The respect that comes with professional success? Anthony smiled, but there was sadness in his expression. I miss the financial security sometimes, but I've learned that there are different kinds of success. Marcus knows I'll be there when he gets home from school. He knows that if he has a nightmare, I'll be in the next room. He knows that his health and happiness are more important to me than any client or deadline. That feels like a pretty significant achievement. Victoria thought about her own life, the empty penthouse apartment she returned to each night, the relationships she had neglected in favor of building her career. She had achieved everything she thought she wanted, but sitting in this supply closet, she couldn't remember the last time she had felt genuinely proud of the life she was living, rather than just the business she was running. I don't even remember why I wanted to run this company, she admitted. When my father died and left it to me, I felt like I had to prove I was worthy of his legacy. But somewhere along the way, proving myself became more important than actually enjoying the work. What would you do if you didn't have to prove anything to anyone? Anthony asked. The question hung in the air between them, and Victoria realized she didn't have an answer. For so long, her identity had been tied to other people's expectations that she had forgotten what her own dreams looked like. The storm outside had intensified, sending lightning flashes across the darkened city as Victoria and Anthony sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. For the first time in months, Victoria felt her shoulders relax, the constant tension she carried finally beginning to ease. But their quiet moment was shattered when the elevator chimed and voices echoed down the hallway. She has to be here somewhere, came a sharp voice that Victoria recognized immediately. Richard Blackwood, the chairman of her board of directors, sounded furious. Security says her car is still in the parking garage and she missed the emergency conference call with our legal team. Victoria's blood turned cold. She had completely forgotten about the 8 o'clock call with the lawyers who were supposed to help strategize their response to Global Tech's departure. The missed meeting would only fuel the board's growing conviction that she was losing control of the situation. Maybe she finally cracked under the pressure, suggested another voice. Helen Morrison, the company's longest-serving board member, had never fully supported Victoria's leadership. I told you 2 years ago that promoting someone so young was a mistake, regardless of her family connections. Anthony saw the color drain from Victoria's face as she pressed herself further back into the supply closet. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and he recognized the signs of a panic attack beginning to build. Without thinking, he reached out and gently took her hand, grounding her in the present moment. Victoria needs to understand that sentiment analysis is shifting against her. Richard continued, his voice growing closer. The Wall Street Journal is already sniffing around the Global Tech story, and if they publish an article questioning her leadership capabilities, our stock price will tank even further. The employees are starting to ask questions too, Helen added. Department heads are requesting private meetings, probably to discuss their concerns about job security. If we don't act quickly to restore confidence, we'll lose more than just one client. Victoria squeezed Anthony's hand tighter, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. Everything she had worked to build was crumbling around her, and the people who were supposed to support her were already planning her downfall. She felt trapped between impossible choices: resign in disgrace, or fight a battle she wasn't sure she could win. The voices moved past the supply closet and continued down the hallway, but their words had done their damage. Victoria slumped against the wall, looking smaller and more defeated than Anthony had thought possible for someone who commanded such a powerful organization. "They're right," she whispered. "I've lost control of everything. Maybe I should just resign and let someone more qualified take over." Anthony studied her face in the dim light filtering through the crack under the door. "Is that what you want to do? Or is that what you think you're supposed to do?" "Does it matter?" Victoria replied bitterly. "The result is the same either way. I'll be remembered as the CEO who couldn't handle pressure, who destroyed her father's legacy because she wasn't strong enough to make the hard decisions. Or you could be remembered as the CEO who had the courage to completely reinvent her company when everyone else thought it was impossible," Anthony suggested quietly. Victoria looked at him with surprise. "How can you still think there's a way out of this? You heard them. The board wants me gone, the employees are losing faith, and the media is circling like vultures. Even if I had a brilliant plan to save the company, I don't have the support to implement it." Anthony was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own experiences with seemingly impossible situations. When Marcus was 6, he was hospitalized for a severe asthma attack. The doctors weren't sure he was going to make it through the night, and I had no insurance to cover the treatment. I was facing medical bills that would have bankrupted us, and I felt completely powerless to help my own son. He paused, remembering the terror of that night. I could have focused on all the things working against us. The debt, the lack of resources, the fact that I was just one person against a massive healthcare system. But instead, I decided to focus on the one thing I could control, being the best advocate possible for Marcus. What did you do? I researched every treatment option, questioned every decision, and refused to accept, that's just how things work, as an answer. I found a charity program that covered most of the costs, connected with other parents who had been through similar situations, and learned enough about asthma management to prevent future emergencies. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wanted to give up, but Marcus is healthy today because I refused to let circumstances define our outcome. Victoria considered his words, feeling a small spark of hope beginning to kindle despite her exhaustion. So you're saying I should fight back instead of accepting defeat? I'm saying you should decide what outcome you actually want and then work backward from there, Anthony replied. If you want to save your company, stop thinking about all the reasons it won't work and start figuring out what it would take to make it work. Before Victoria could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent message. The text was from her assistant. Emergency board meeting called for 7 a.m. tomorrow. Richard is bringing a motion to remove you as CEO. He's already contacted 3 potential replacement candidates. Victoria stared at the screen, feeling the walls closing in around her. They're not even waiting for the press to destroy me, she said. They're going to do it themselves. Anthony read the message over her shoulder and frowned. How many board members are there? 7, including me. So Richard needs 4 votes to remove you? Yes, and he probably already has them. Helen Morrison has never supported me. And David Chen and Patricia Williams have been questioning my decisions since the global tech situation started. That's 4 votes right there. Anthony studied her face, seeing defeat where he hoped to see determination. What about the other 3 members? Thomas Rodriguez has always been neutral. Sarah Kim might support me, but she's been quiet lately. And Jonathan Walsh is my father's oldest friend, but even he's been expressing concerns about my leadership style. So you need to convince at least 2 of them that you're worth supporting, Anthony said. That means you need to walk into that meeting tomorrow with a plan that's so compelling they can't ignore it. Victoria laughed bitterly. A plan to do what? Replace 40% of our revenue overnight? Magically restore confidence in my leadership? Convince global tech to change their minds? A plan to transform your company into something better than what global tech was keeping you from becoming, Anthony replied firmly. You said yourself that you've been turning down interesting opportunities to keep them happy. What if losing them opens doors that were closed before? Victoria began pacing in the small confines of the supply closet, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. Even if I could develop a convincing turnaround strategy overnight, I'd need data to support it. Market research, financial projections, competitive analysis, the kind of comprehensive presentation that usually takes weeks to prepare. What if you didn't try to do it alone? Anthony suggested. You said the employees are asking questions. Maybe they're not just worried about job security. Maybe they're also frustrated with the direction the company has been taking and would welcome a chance to contribute to something different. The idea intrigued Victoria, but she shook her head. I can't ask my staff to work all night on a presentation that might not even matter. If the board votes me out tomorrow, I won't be able to protect anyone who supported me. But if you don't try, you'll definitely lose everything, Anthony pointed out. And from what you've told me about your employees, they sound like people who would rather fight for something they believe in than watch it die without trying. Victoria stopped pacing and looked at Anthony with new respect. You really think it's possible? To completely redesign our business model in one night and present it convincingly enough to save my job? I think it's possible to try, Anthony replied. And I think you'll regret it forever, if you don't. Victoria felt something shift inside her, a familiar feeling she hadn't experienced since the early days of her career, when challenges excited her rather than terrified her. It would be incredibly risky. If we fail, everyone who helps me could face retaliation from the new leadership. And if you succeed? Victoria's eyes began to brighten as possibilities started forming in her mind. If we succeed, we could build the kind of company I've always wanted to lead. Innovative, ethical, focused on long-term value rather than short-term profits. The kind of place where people are excited to come to work because they're solving problems that matter. Anthony smiled, recognizing the transformation taking place in front of him. Now you're starting to sound like a CEO worth fighting for. Victoria pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. Maria Santos in our research department has been pushing for months to explore the sustainability market. James Chen in technology has proposals for streamlining our smaller client processes. Rebecca Foster in business development has a whole list of potential clients we've never pursued because they didn't fit Global Tech's preferences. Sounds like you already have the foundation for your new strategy, Anthony observed. I have pieces, Victoria corrected, but pulling them together into a coherent presentation that addresses every concern the board might raise, that's going to take all night and more expertise than I have alone. Anthony stood up and straightened his uniform. Then we'd better get started. Victoria looked at him with surprise. We? Anthony, you don't have to get involved in this. You have your own life, your own responsibilities. I can't ask you to risk your job for my problems. You're not asking, Anthony replied simply. I'm volunteering. Besides, Marcus is at his grandmother's house tonight, and I've got nothing but time until my shift ends at 6 a.m. Victoria felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. Why would you do this for me? We barely know each other. Anthony considered the question, thinking about the woman he had found hiding in a supply closet and the executive who was now beginning to emerge from her fear. Because everyone deserves someone in their corner when they're fighting for something that matters. And because I have a feeling that the company you're imagining could change a lot of lives for the better. Victoria nodded, feeling more determined than she had in months. All right then, let's save my company. The conference room on the 35th floor had never seen anything quite like the scene that unfolded over the next 6 hours. Victoria had sent carefully worded messages to 5 key employees, asking them to meet her for an urgent strategy session. She hadn't mentioned the board's planned coup or the precarious nature of her position, only that she needed their expertise for a critical presentation that could determine the company's future. Maria Santos arrived first, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and exhaustion evident in her eyes. As the head of market research, she had been working overtime trying to identify new revenue streams since the Global Tech announcement. When she saw Anthony emptying trash cans in the corner of the room, she paused, clearly confused about why a janitor was present during what appeared to be a high-level strategy meeting. Maria, I'd like you to meet Anthony Rodriguez, Victoria said, her voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. He's going to be helping us tonight. Maria's confusion deepened, but she was too professional to question Victoria's decisions openly. James Chen from the technology department arrived next, followed by Rebecca Foster from business development. Each employee showed the same momentary surprise at Anthony's presence, but Victoria's calm acceptance of his role seemed to reassure them that his involvement was intentional. I'm going to be completely honest with all of you. Victoria began once everyone was seated around the polished conference table. The board is planning to remove me as CEO tomorrow morning. They believe that losing Global Tech proves I'm not capable of leading this company through difficult times. The room fell silent. Maria's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup, and James leaned back in his chair as if the words had physically pushed him. Rebecca was the first to speak, her voice tight with concern. What are our options? She asked simply. Victoria appreciated that Rebecca didn't waste time with sympathy or outrage. We have one chance to change their minds. I need to walk into that boardroom tomorrow with a comprehensive plan that demonstrates not only how we can survive without Global Tech, but how we can thrive in ways that weren't possible while we were constrained by their requirements. Anthony watched the dynamics around the table with interest. These weren't just employees following orders. They were professionals who genuinely cared about the company's mission and their colleagues' futures. The tension in the room was palpable, but so was a growing sense of determination. What kind of time frame are we working with? James asked, already pulling out his tablet to take notes. "The meeting is at 7 a.m., Victoria replied, "which gives us about 8 hours to develop a complete business transformation strategy, including financial projections, market analysis, and implementation timelines." Maria whistled softly. "That's ambitious, even for us." "It's impossible," James corrected bluntly. "A presentation of that scope would normally take our entire team several weeks to prepare properly." Anthony cleared his throat, drawing surprised looks from around the table. "What if you're not starting from scratch?" he suggested. "Victoria mentioned that you've all been developing ideas and proposals that got shelved because they didn't align with global tech's preferences. Instead of creating something entirely new, what if you combined existing work into a cohesive strategy?" Rebecca's eyes lit up with understanding. "He's right. I've got at least 15 client prospects that we turned away because global tech considered them too small or too unconventional." "Maria, don't you have that comprehensive report on emerging markets that got buried last year? The sustainability analysis?" Maria nodded enthusiastically. 200 pages of research that showed massive growth potential in environmental consulting. Global tech's executives thought it was a waste of resources. James was already scrolling through files on his tablet. "And I've got designs for a streamlined project management system that could handle multiple smaller clients simultaneously. It would have reduced our efficiency with large-scale projects like global tech's, but it would be perfect for serving dozens of smaller companies." Anthony smiled as he watched the energy in the room shift from despair to excitement. "So you don't need to invent new solutions. You need to organize existing solutions into a presentation that shows how they work together?" Victoria felt a surge of hope as she realized Anthony was right. Her team hadn't been idle during the global tech years. They had been developing innovative ideas that were simply incompatible with their largest client's conservative approach. Now those same ideas could become the foundation for a completely new business model. "Let's divide the work," Victoria decided. "Maria, can you compile your market research into a comprehensive analysis of growth opportunities in environmental consulting, technology startups, and other sectors we've been ignoring?" "Absolutely," Maria replied, already opening her laptop. "I'll need about 3 hours to pull together the data and create projections for revenue potential." "James, how long would it take to outline the technical infrastructure changes we'd need to serve multiple smaller clients efficiently?" James considered the question carefully. "If I focus on adapting existing proposals rather than designing new systems, I could have a preliminary framework ready in 4 hours. It won't be perfect, but it'll be functional." "Rebecca, what about client acquisition strategy? How many of those prospects you mentioned are still viable?" Rebecca grinned, the first genuine smile anyone had seen in the office for weeks. "Most of them, actually. Several have been asking if we've reconsidered their proposals. I could probably secure preliminary agreements with at least 6 companies within the next month, representing about 15% of our lost global tech revenue." Anthony had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement. These people weren't just competent. They were genuinely innovative professionals who had been constrained by a business model that didn't utilize their full potential. "What's stopping you from replacing more than 15%? he asked Rebecca. "Capacity, mainly," she replied. "Our current systems are designed for large-scale, long-term projects. Serving multiple smaller clients would require different workflows, faster turnaround times, and more flexible service packages." "But James is already working on solutions for those technical challenges," Anthony pointed out. "And Maria's research probably identifies enough market demand to replace global tech's revenue several times over." Victoria felt pieces clicking into place in her mind. "We're not just presenting a survival strategy," she realized aloud. "We're presenting a growth strategy that positions us as leaders in emerging markets instead of followers in established ones." "Exactly," Anthony agreed. "Instead of defending why losing global tech isn't fatal, you're explaining why losing them is actually liberating." The next 4 hours passed in a blur of focused activity. Maria worked with spreadsheets and market data, building compelling arguments for why environmental consulting and technology startups represented better long-term investments than traditional corporate clients. James sketched out technical architectures that could handle multiple project streams simultaneously, drawing on years of frustrated creativity that had been suppressed by global tech's rigid requirements. Rebecca made phone calls to contacts she hadn't spoken with in months, reconnecting with potential clients who had been waiting for Meridian Financial to become available. The conversations were encouraging. Several companies had been hoping for exactly the kind of innovative analysis that Victoria's team was proposing to offer. Anthony found himself naturally filling the role of coordinator, helping team members connect their different areas of expertise and ensuring that all components of the presentation would integrate smoothly. His accounting background proved invaluable for understanding the financial implications of their proposed changes, while his outside perspective helped identify assumptions that might not be obvious to people who had been immersed in the corporate culture for years. "The numbers are better than I expected," Maria announced around 3 a.m., stretching to relieve the tension in her shoulders. "If we can capture just 30% of the environmental consulting market in our region, we generate 20% more revenue than global tech was providing. And the technical infrastructure to support that growth is completely feasible," James added. "In fact, it would make our operations more efficient across all client categories." Victoria looked around the table at her exhausted but energized team. "So we're really saying that we can not only survive without global tech, but actually improve our profitability and market position?" "Better than that," Rebecca said, consulting her notes from the evening's phone calls. "We're saying that we can build a more stable business model that doesn't depend on any single client for survival. And we can do it by focusing on sectors that align with our actual interests and expertise instead of just our biggest paycheck." Anthony watched Victoria's transformation throughout the night with fascination. The defeated woman he had found hiding in the supply closet had evolved into a confident leader orchestrating a complex strategic initiative. She asked insightful questions, made decisive choices about resource allocation, and somehow managed to keep everyone focused on their goals despite the enormous pressure they were all feeling. But it was more than just professional competence that Anthony observed. Victoria had rediscovered her passion for the work itself, not just the success it might bring her. She was genuinely excited about the prospect of building a company that reflected her values, rather than just her ambitions. "There's one more component we need to address," Victoria said as dawn began to brighten the windows. "The board is going to ask about leadership stability. They'll want to know why they should trust me to implement this strategy when they believe I failed to manage the global tech relationship properly." The room grew quiet as everyone considered this challenge. All the market research and technical planning in the world wouldn't matter if the board remained convinced that Victoria was unsuited for the CEO position. Anthony stood up and walked to the whiteboard where they had been sketching out organizational charts. "What if the real problem isn't your leadership abilities?" he said slowly, "but the leadership model you've been trying to follow?" Victoria looked at him with curiosity. "What do you mean?" "You've been trying to lead like a traditional CEO, making all the major decisions yourself and taking personal responsibility for every outcome," Anthony explained. "But tonight, you've been leading like a collaborator, bringing together different expertise to solve complex problems. Which approach feels more natural to you?" Victoria considered the question, thinking about how energized she had felt working alongside her team rather than simply directing their efforts. "The collaborative approach," she admitted, "but the board expects a CEO to be a strong individual leader who can make tough decisions independently." "Maybe it's time to redefine what strong leadership looks like," Anthony suggested. "Instead of defending your individual decision-making, what if you demonstrate how your collaborative approach produces better results than traditional top-down management?" Maria nodded thoughtfully. "The work we've accomplished tonight wouldn't have been possible under a traditional management structure. We needed someone who could see connections between different departments and facilitate genuine cooperation. And the strategy we've developed is stronger because it incorporates multiple perspectives rather than just one person's vision," James added. Rebecca was already making notes. "We could present this as a new leadership model for a new business strategy. Collaborative decision-making for complex market challenges." Victoria felt the final piece of their presentation falling into place. She wouldn't apologize for her leadership style or try to convince the board that she could become something she wasn't. Instead, she would demonstrate why her natural leadership approach was exactly what the company needed for its next phase of growth. "All right," she said, looking around the table at her teammates and co-conspirators. "Let's finish this presentation and give the board something they've never seen before." The boardroom fell silent as Victoria finished her presentation at exactly 7:47 a.m. Richard Blackwood sat frozen, his prepared motion to remove her as CEO forgotten on the table beside him. Helen Morrison's skeptical expression had gradually transformed into something approaching admiration. The other board members leaned forward in their chairs, studying the comprehensive business transformation plan that had materialized overnight. "This is remarkable work," Thomas Rodriguez said, finally breaking the silence. "But can you realistically implement such extensive changes while maintaining current operations?" Victoria stood confidently at the head of the table, no longer the defeated woman who had hidden in a supply closet 12 hours earlier. The beauty of this strategy is that it builds on systems and relationships we've already developed. We're not abandoning our core competencies, we're expanding them into markets that offer better growth potential. Richard cleared his throat, clearly struggling to adjust his prepared arguments. The timeline seems aggressive. How do you plan to secure enough new clients to offset the global tech revenue within 6 months? Rebecca stepped forward from her position near the presentation screen. "I've already received preliminary commitments from 8 companies representing 22% of our lost revenue. These clients have been waiting for exactly the kind of innovative analysis we're proposing to offer." Anthony watched from the back corner of the room, officially present as building maintenance but actually serving as Victoria's secret advisor. He had coached her on presentation techniques learned from years of explaining complex problems to doctors, teachers, and social workers who held Marcus's future in their hands. "What about the technology infrastructure required for this transition?" David Chen asked, his tone more curious than challenging. James answered smoothly, "The modular systems I've designed can be implemented incrementally without disrupting current client services. We'll actually improve efficiency across all accounts, not just the new ones." Victoria saw the shift happening around the table. Board members who had arrived prepared to discuss her replacement were now asking detailed questions about implementation strategies. "The most important element of this plan," she said, "is that it reflects our company's actual strengths, rather than constraining them to fit one client's preferences." Helen Morrison, who had been Victoria's harshest critic, surprised everyone by speaking up. "I have to admit, this is the most excited I've been about our company's direction in years. The environmental consulting market alone could position us as industry leaders." "So we're withdrawing the motion for leadership change?" Thomas asked, looking around the table. Richard Blackwood hesitated, clearly reluctant to abandon his carefully planned coup. "The strategy is impressive," he conceded, "but implementing it successfully will require strong execution. Are you confident you can deliver these results, Victoria?" Victoria smiled, thinking about the collaborative leadership model she had discovered overnight. "I'm confident that our team can deliver these results. This presentation wasn't created by one person making isolated decisions. It represents the combined expertise of our most talented employees working together toward a shared vision." The vote was unanimous. Victoria would remain as CEO, and the board approved her business transformation plan with full funding authorization. As the meeting concluded and board members filed out discussing implementation details, Anthony quietly slipped away to resume his cleaning duties. Victoria found him an hour later in the supply closet where their conversation had begun. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply. "None of this would have happened without your help." Anthony smiled, organizing cleaning supplies with the same methodical care he had shown throughout their overnight collaboration. "You had everything you needed already. You just needed someone to help you see it clearly." "I've been thinking about what you said regarding different kinds of success," Victoria continued. "I want to offer you a position in our business development department. Your insights about collaborative problem-solving could be invaluable." Anthony considered the offer carefully. "I appreciate that, but I've learned to be happy with work that lets me be present for Marcus. However, I'd like to propose something different." Victoria listened as Anthony outlined his idea for a consulting partnership. He would work with Meridian Financial on specific projects that matched his expertise, providing outside perspective while maintaining the flexibility to prioritize his role as a father. 6 months later, Meridian Financial had exceeded every projection from Victoria's presentation. The environmental consulting division had grown into their most profitable department. The collaborative leadership model had improved employee satisfaction and client retention across all sectors. Anthony's consulting work had helped them develop innovative approaches to complex problems, while his primary focus remained on raising Marcus. Victoria stood in her corner office, looking out at the city skyline where storm clouds were gathering for another evening downpour. She thought about the woman who had hidden in that supply closet, terrified of losing everything she thought to find her success. That woman had been focused on preserving what she had, rather than creating what she wanted. The transformation hadn't just saved her company. It had saved her understanding of what leadership actually meant. Success wasn't about controlling outcomes or impressing other people. It was about bringing out the best in everyone around you and building something meaningful together. Anthony knocked on her open door, Marcus beside him carrying a school project about renewable energy that he wanted to show the CEO who was making environmental consulting famous. Victoria smiled, remembering the night when a janitor had taught her that the most important problems were often solved by people willing to pay attention to overlooked details. Sometimes the wisest voices came from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the best solutions emerged when you stopped trying to fix everything alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.